Cool. Welcome. So I'm Owen Vallis, professor of music technology at CalArts, and I teach the synthesis courses there using Reactor, and also teach a course on Kadenze about synthesis using Reactor as well. So today we're going to take some questions, mostly about building in Reactor and essentially how to do your own synthesizers from scratch, things like that. So if you want to watch, this is on YouTube right now, and I'll be screen sharing with my setup here. So if you want to see what I'm building as I'm talking through stuff, that's probably the best spot to watch that. And I guess we'll be looking at Facebook and YouTube for questions. So if you guys have other questions, feel free to submit those and we'll try and get to them. So yeah, to start, one of the questions that was asked, let's see, Jordan submitted a question. If you were trapped on a desert island and could choose just 5 modules from Reactor to keep you busy until help arrived, what would they be and why? So it's actually a really great question because when I was first learning Reactor, I learned it from Martin Swartjes was teaching at CalArts, and he developed a lot of stuff for Reactor. And he would always sort of say, all you really need is like an add, a multiply, and like a 1 sample delay. And you can kind of build almost anything you want. And actually like an add and a subtract. Yeah, you'd even just do it with an add and a multiply. But I'm going to show you what I mean is that essentially with these very basic pieces, you can build a lot of things. And it's really cool to think of audio and signal processing in this way. In these tiny low-level blocks. So with that, I'm going to jump over to a screen share and share my Reactor screen, and I'll talk through what I'm doing here. But essentially, what I kind of want to go through is working in core, which is very much like primary. Almost everything you can do in core, you can do also in Reactor primary, which is what most people use. Reactor's made up these 2 levels, I guess. The difference with core is it compiles down to like assembly and or machine code basically, and it's really great, I feel, for working sample by sample at this kind of low level. So with that in mind, I'm just going to create a little core cell here. So let's see. So I say new core cell, and this brings me into a view that looks slightly different than the primary view. And what I'm going to do is add in those modules I was talking about. So we're going to add in a add module. And then I'm also going to add in a multiply. And the other one I said was this 1 sample delay. So the 1 sample delay should be a little z minus 1 like this. And so what we got here now is essentially a way to merge signals together to change their amplitude or scale them, and a way to delay them. So with this very basic setup, what I should be able to do is say, take the input. So this will be some signal coming in. And right now you'll notice the dot is orange, but I'm going to change that to white. So this is just like an audio signal coming in here like this. And if I say, take this signal, plus, I'm going to put the signal in here, and do this, this is essentially version of the signal, right? So if this one came in right here, this will be the previous sample, right? So there's a 1 sample delay. And then what I'm going to do is multiply this by 0.5, which essentially says, because if I had 2 full volume signals here, so one was 1, the other one was 1, then there'd be twice as loud. So to make it the same volume as it was previously, I have to multiply it by half. So multiplying it by half here now, I'm going to output this signal. And the same thing here is I want to go ahead and make sure that this is an audio signal. So now we've taken an audio signal in, I've taken my current one and the previous one, multiplied them by half, and we send it back out. So what did we just do? Well, this is essentially a filter. And the way to think of this is that if you want to take the average of something, right? And the example I always use when I'm teaching this is the average of everybody's height in the room. And so the simplest way would be to take everybody's height and add it all up together, and then you just divide by the number of people in the room, right? So add their heights together, divide by 10. Well, in this case, I have two signals, and I'm just adding them together and dividing by 2. It's the same thing as multiplying by 0.5. And what this does is this gives me the average level between these 2 points in time, these 2 signal values. And taking the average of something is the same thing as kind of smoothing it out, right? So this is essentially a low-pass filter. So if I wanted a more aggressive filter, what I could do is say, now I want to duplicate this delay yet again. So now I'm going to say this signal will come out of this delay here. So now this will be 2 samples ago. And I'm going to duplicate my add. So add in another signal here, like this. And then I'm going to multiply this by 0.33, right? So now again, I'm sort of just compensating for that I'm taking 3 samples. But what we've really done is now I'm taking the average of the last 3 samples. And what this does is essentially this means that now I have a larger number of samples to choose from, and so it's going to be smoother than just the 2 samples. I could continue this for a very long time and come up with a very complicated filter. And in fact, just to sort of demonstrate how complicated this can get, this is what's known as a finite impulse response filter, in that if I put a signal in, it'll eventually fade away. I'm just kind of scaling delayed versions of itself. But you can use this to model stuff explicitly, right? So you can say, hey, I want it to sound exactly like this particular filter, or have these kind of behaviors. So what I'm going to do here is go and look for an old ensemble I built in Reactor 5. So I go here to my library, and then to ensembles, and then to my stuff. And in here is a echo machine. And I was reading a paper on modeling some old school delay pedals and stuff, and they require a very specific type of filter. So this is a very extreme version of what we were just talking about, where this is going to take a bunch of inputs and scale them by very, very specific amounts. So, you know, up until now, I was saying that if you want to take the average of everyone's height in the room, we just add them all up and divide by the number of people. But the problem with that is that it applies equal weight to everybody in the room. But when you're designing different filters, if we begin to bias or weight to certain parts of the signal, or, you know, certain heights, maybe somebody who's really, really tall or really, really small, they would throw off the average. So maybe we would have them influence the final value less. So we can kind of go in here and tweak these sorts of things and come up with very, very specific filters. So this particular case here is still only using these adds and delays and multiplies, but I'm able to model almost exactly this very specific, I think it's called a Salling key filter, that was used in these old bucket brigade delays. So it's really interesting. And in fact, using these Z-1s, even though it would be kind of a very brute force way to do it, you could begin to do all sorts of things like creating buffers that you can keep signals in, and then you can sort of refer to them at different points. We can create feedback loops, which allow us to do things like physical models. You know, with this, you could do like a very simple implementation of what's known as car plus strung, which is like the, it's like a plucked string model. You can even make oscillators with this. There's a few more modules you would need. So far, I was allowed 5. So we've talked about a delay, we've talked about an add, and we've talked about a multiply. If I'm also allowed a router and a compare, which is kind of like our if statement, then we can make an oscillator as well. So let's take a look at that really quick. So if I go here and I'm just going to say, again, I'm going to make a totally new ensemble. So I'm all alone on my island here, and I have lots of time to make stuff. I've made lots of delays and filters now, and now I want an oscillator, something that makes sound. So again, I'm going to go in here and say, give me an add. Give me, actually in this case, they're kind of, yeah, I'm going to extend slightly more than 5, but it'll still work. So with flow, we're going to need this router and a compare. So this is just going to be like a way of testing or asking a question in Reactor. And then I need a read and a write, which is related to the z-1, right? So these, I'll show you in 1 second here. And again, this is what I really like about Core, is that you can dive into the lowest levels of things, right? So if I say z-1 here, if I jump inside this module, it actually consists of reads, writes, latches, right? So I'm sort of still using the same basic modules here. And what we want to do is create a feedback loop. So I'll explain this as I build it. Essentially, what I want to say is this module here reads a value, and I want to add some very small number to it. Let's just say something like 0.001, something very small. And I'm going to connect it up here to this module here. So this is a write. So this just stores a value. And then I can clock this value like this. And now what I'm doing is every sample that comes through, I'm actually clocking or asking for the value that was written here. So let's just say it's 0 in the beginning. This says, hey, what was your value? Oh, it's 0. Let's add some small number to it and then store it here. So now this is this tiny number. And then I do it again and add this tiny number to it so it's twice as big. And then, you know, we keep adding this number, and you can think of this as like a stair step or ramp that goes up. This is just going to continually count upwards. It's just a counter. So there's nothing very exciting about this. However, if I go ahead and ask a question now and say, is this number greater than +1? Now I can control what happens. So I can say, if it's not larger than 1, then let's just continue to grow the number. But as soon as it becomes larger than 1, do something with it. And so if we think about what an oscillator is just something that continually repeats a cycle. And the simplest cycle would be this ramp that I was talking about. And when we reach a certain point, it just starts over. And in fact, this waveform should feel very familiar. This is a sawtooth, right, or a ramp wave. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to say if it becomes larger than 1, then what I want to do is replace it. So I'm going to use what's known as a latch. And again, if we go inside the latch, we'll see it's still just read and write modules. So I'm still working within my limited 5 modules here. But what we're really going to say is the input signal comes in, and this clock signal essentially drives the output here. So what we're going to say is if I get a value at this point, replace it with the number 1. And in fact, what we're going to do is replace it with the number -1, like this. I'm going to make one last jump, and then I'll explain the whole thing together. So if I say a merge, like this is the last piece here. What we've done is now built a very simple, and there's lots wrong with this one, but it's all right. This is the first, most basic sawtooth oscillator, or phaser is probably the best thing to call it. But what this does now is, like I said before, if we start at 0 here, I read 0 at this sample, add a small number to it, check to make sure that that number is not larger than 1, which it won't be. Then I just pass that along. And we repeat this process until the point at which I become slightly larger than 1, just like a tiny amount larger than 1. At that point, I replace its value with -1. Now -1 gets written here, and I begin to add a small amount. And again, -1 plus some small number is still smaller than 1, so we're just going to count up again until we get to something slightly larger than 1, and then it just repeats. And this is how we create an oscillator. If I were to plug this in, we would hear the sound of this oscillator coming out of the speakers. But But there's all sorts of things, like I said, that was wrong with this particular one. It's too simple. So first off is I've just put a random number in here to accumulate at sample rate. So the frequency is fixed at the moment. And there's no way to easily relate this number to frequency. We would need some conversion, right? The other thing is this suffers from aliasing. Really cool. And if you want the most hardcore aliased wave that has just got all sorts of digital artifacts, this is the oscillator that you want. This is like a great way to do this. It sounds all sorts of terrible, and that's fantastic. If you want like a really nice analog modeled anti-aliased oscillator, this is definitely not the one that you want to be using. But to understand how that stuff works, this is a great place to start. So now we've created a filter. We've shown how we can create delays. We've shown how we can create oscillators. And we can use these oscillators now to do things like write to our delay lines. We can write to buffers. We can modulate our delays. We can drive circular buffer stuff. There's so much that you can build with just this, the read, the write, an add, a multiply, and then the flow structure. So I'm going to kind of cheat and say that merge, flow, and router, or compare and router are all kind of part of the same thing. So, so that would be my desert island selection of objects, I think, because from that you can build pretty much anything. So with that, and I'll just give a quick demonstration. I'm not sure how much of it will come through, but it's kind of fun to see. So if I go to recent files and just open up this echo machine, let me turn down the volume just so it doesn't explode. And if I turn this up, I should be able to get, see if this will work here. Right, so all of that kind of stuff, and it's nice and organic in that it's, and a key to that is instability and sort of plugging enough feedback stuff so that it's not 100% under your control all the time. You can create a lot of amazing things. And like I said, this is, this is sort of the brute force way to do it. But there's a lot of cool tools in the new Reactor actually for making your own filters from scratch if you want to do that kind of stuff. They have a whole toolkit for that, for those of you that are interested in doing that kind of thing. Okay, so that was sort of a long, rambling explanation of what I would take to a desert island. That's all I have is my laptop. What other questions would be interesting? Let's see. Do I ever think we will reach a point where digital models are indistinguishable from true analog synthesis? Yeah, I do. I think so. There's some challenges, but yeah, so basically a lot of the challenge comes from, well, so part of the thing is to get the models to sound great with having low CPU or being able to calculate them in real time. And computers keep getting faster, and we keep finding better methods for approximating stuff, and then just minimizing the error between the two is ongoing work, and every year it gets better. So I feel confident that that gap will continue to close, and I think even now we're getting closer, and I'll probably look back on this in 5 years and be like, wow, we were so far out, but just continually things sound better all the time. I love the way analog gear sounds, and I love the way digital gear sounds. And while I think there is a gap, and I fully think that analog gear sounds amazing, I think sometimes trying to chase the analog gear, it's an interesting exercise from a software point of view to try and make something that sounds exactly like analog stuff. And it really helps inform future digital synth designs, I think. So a really great example of that is work by a Karma student out of Stanford, and he's been working on some modeling of the 808 kick drum, and it has interest in stuff like the circuit bending in 808. So for those of you that know what circuit bending is, or for those of you that don't, rather, I suppose, circuit bending is when you go into a circuit and short circuit or add extra connections that weren't there before, and you sort of modify the circuit in a way that allows you to get in there and create new sounds. So with the 808, we like to do things like extend the decay or be able to modify the pitch modulation and things like this. And there's two problems or challenges with doing that. Is one, the 808 is an expensive, increasingly rare piece of gear, and to go in there and just attach new parts, it's kind of scary. You can break it, and it's a shame if you end up ruining an 808. So, you know, it's almost a little scary to modify a piece of gear like that. It'd be like taking a drill to an old school guitar or something. But also with software, you can begin to make bends that aren't really possible in the analog world. So just because you can think of something that you might want to modify doesn't mean there's an easy way to do it in the analog world. In the digital domain, with code, you can kind of jump in between any point you want. So I think that that is really interesting as well. So yeah, I think that we're closing the gap. I think companies like Universal Audio are doing really great work. I think there's really amazing soft synths being developed by lots of different people, and filters have made huge leaps and bounds. I think oscillators are sounding better. And to be honest, if you crank up your sampling rate, like in Reactor, you can change it to something like 176K, and you know, a lot of the aliasing will vanish. So upsampling is a really easy way to begin to negate a lot of the digital artifacts and make things sound better. Again, it's all a trade-off with CPU, right? If your computer can run it, you can get really close these days. And a good example of that is a program called LP Spice, which essentially will run schematics. So you can define a whole circuit, and let me see if I'm sharing that right now. So in LT Spice, you can go through and define an entire circuit like this, and it'll go through, solve all of the whole system, and you can even output audio. And so it's a really great way to see how analog systems behave, and these types of models won't even run in real time. So these actually get really close and sound really good. So like I said, I think it's just a matter of compute power before we can get to something like that. So I think it is coming, but there's still a little bit of work to do. So what else? Let's see. Are there any ideas common in text-based programming that I miss when working in node-based systems like Reactor? And what node-based concepts do I wish were available in text-based programming? That's a great question. So yeah, the main difference is in node-based programming, you have the ability to draw out visually the flow of the signal. And that really helps, I feel, sometimes in thinking about or conceptualizing your synthesizer. I feel it's much easier to build an instrument if you sort of think about, this is my oscillator, and then I'm going to hook the wire into a filter, and then that goes into a modulator. And thinking in this kind of way it's very conducive to building instruments and thinking about signal flow. When it comes to text programming, it's much more abstract. You create sort of a description of these blocks of your instrument, and then you organize, put them together. And so sometimes I think that can be a little more disconnected and challenging to think about the signal flow. There's interesting programs like Chuck, where they try and define the different objects, and you can plug them together using this Chuck operator. So that sort of bridges the two worlds. But I do feel these node-based approaches are much nicer for thinking about signal flow and how these different pieces play together and all merge and diverge and create different parts of your instrument. Having said that, the most powerful thing in text programming that I wish I had more of in something like Reactor is the ability to dynamically create stuff on the fly. So Reactor is really great for, like, here's my oscillator, and again, like I said, plug it into this part, and with polyphony you can kind of do some things for creating tons of versions of things. So we can take a look at that in a second. But with text, it's all about describing an abstract concept. So I can be like, here is my sequencer or my algorithm or my probabilistic whatever, and I want 100 of these. A concrete example would be something very challenging to build in Reactor would be if I wanted a particle-based system that made sound. So I wanted a way to have 1 million particles flying around in some sort of relationship that then drove some sort of stochastic synthesis. In order to do this in Reactor, I would have to describe one of these particles and then find a way to make 1 million of them. And like I said, with polyphony, we'll look at it in a second, there's a way to kind of do that, but it's really hard and it's very difficult to dynamically create these and make them disappear on the fly, where that's very simple to do in coding. On the flip side, before we look at the polyphony stuff in Reactor, there's kind of the structural organization in text coding. I think you can make extremely complicated objects or instruments or ideas in text code that are really dynamic and have very complex relationships, but organizing that in Reactor creates like this rat's nest of cables. And if anyone's ever tried to build something like that, I'm sure everyone suffered from just a little bit of carpal tunnel from trying to connect hundreds of wires in Max or Reactor or something like that. So I think that's a challenge, and there is good techniques for organizing your Reactor programs to help mitigate that, but I think in node-based programming, that's sort of always going to be a challenge. So let's take a look at that really quick, actually, because I think the polyphony thing is one of the coolest parts about Reactor. So what I mean about the polyphony thing is you can do this cool trick where normally the way Reactor looks at polyphony is as voices, right? So when you hold down keys on a synthesizer, each key in a truly polyphonic synthesizer, each key plays its own note. And then, you know, you're going to need basically duplicates of that synthesizer signal path in order to play more notes. So in a digital system, it's very easy. We just create one, and then it'll just create virtual copies of this. So let's do something very simple. So I want to do an oscillator, right? So we'll just say something here like a sine wave. And if I wanted to play 4 of these, what I would need is what's known as a voice combiner, like this. And I will plug this into the output for the speakers. And then I would need some sort of input. So for right now, what I'm going to do is just set this to a constant of very, very quiet volume. And let's just do MIDI pitch in, right? So we'll do, let's go here like this. We'll say MIDI in, and we'll grab our note pitch. And I'll do the simplest type of envelope. I'll just do a multiply here like this. All right, and when I press a note now, I should get a value here which will multiply against my signal, and then we'll be able to hear it. So this is as simple as it gets. So now if I play one note, I should hear something. And all that clicking is because the gate just immediately shuts off. So this is a terrible synth, but it's very easy to illustrate the point. So right now I have just one voice. And if I go over here to the top left where it says voices, and I say 2 voices, I now have the ability to play 2 notes at once. And what's cool here is I didn't have to build anything else to get that second voice. And this is one of the biggest, I think, leaps of understanding in using Reactor, for me anyways, was thinking about the fact that what I'm building here is just a blueprint. This isn't the actual synthesizer. So when I press one note and then press a second note, it's actually created 2 virtual synthesizers based off of this blueprint. And then it combines those 2 signals together using the audio voice combiner and sends it to the output so we can hear it. And if I were to increase this, I could do something like 100 possible voices, and that would still work. So now I can hold down 100 notes and hear them all at once. So this is cool, but where it gets really interesting is when you use something called the voice info. So if you look for this voice info module, what this does is it will give you a ID for each voice. So what this means is if I do something like, I'm going to add here like this. So I'm just going to say plus V, and then if I have my debug on and I hover over here, you can see that each one of the polyphonic voices has a unique value associated with it. So again, this might not seem so exciting right away, but combining this with this blueprint idea means that each polyphonic voice can have its own value. So a concrete thing that was really cool is I took a table object, and then you can say send the value out to a different polyphonic voice. So you can say send this value to voice 10, send it to voice whatever. And in that way, I was able to draw in a spread of pitches. So you can go in and create all of these sort of complex, where each voice has its own either random number, some number that's based off of the voice ID, some number that you draw into a table. Essentially, you can begin to add voice-specific control. And this is about as close as you can get to sort of this dynamic object creation, where you just create like hundreds of voices, and then you can assign individual values to each of them. So a good example of something that works that way would be, what would be cool that we could take a look at? Well, maybe we'll come back to that. Let me look at some questions to keep going. And then if anyone's interested, we can open up some of the factory ensembles and dive in and kind of see. Someone who's really good at using this technique is known as Lazyfish, and he's built a ton of amazing content. He's probably one of my favorite Reactor library developers, and his content is amazing if you want to look and learn how Reactor works. Yeah, so let's see what other questions. See, when you want to model an existing synth sound, a synth or sound in Reactor, what approach do I take, and do I use any additional tools? It depends. I think for me, what I try and do is when I'm building stuff in Reactor, the first thing I try and do is come up with a signal diagram. So I'll read a great resource. If you've ever come across Sound on Sound magazine, has like a 5-year series on synthesis. It's amazing, and I really recommend it. And there's a lot of really fantastic information in there, as well as some really fantastic block diagrams where they essentially show the signal flow. And the beautiful thing about this is you don't have to worry about what the object's called. You don't have to worry about implementation or how things are built. You're only focusing on the signal flow. And in fact, I think this is one of the more useful exercises that I ever did, was to go and crawl through a whole bunch of old analog synthesizers and try and find and understand their block diagrams. Things like the SH101 or the ARP or these kinds of things, to try and understand why is the Moog different, the Mini Moog different from the SH101? What is actually different in the signal flow? What modulation sources did they choose? All of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's the starting point, is hunting down the block diagram. And a great place for block diagrams is the service manuals. So back in the day when your analog gear would break down, someone would need to fix it, and companies released service manuals that would have all sorts of really great information about what the parts were that you needed, what the signal flow was, what the PCB looked like, and crawling through that stuff begins to give you a sense of how all these things are put together. So once I have a block diagram, then it's just about converting it into the most basic version in Reactor. So that's probably step one. And then once I have a basic version of it, then it's about hunting down more specific information, like looking at the papers, trying to go on Google and find out, has anyone done any research for modeling different types of delays or filters or these kinds of things, and beginning to try and come up with custom DSP or areas that I can tweak to make the basic model closer to the analog version. Then sort of the last step, which is something I'm currently working on for stuff, is, you know, you're constantly listening to the real thing, listening to what you're working on, and you know, you can get all the way into trying to solve or do a digital version of the analog circuit itself. And again, all of this stuff, understanding it, personally, I've never been able to make anything that sounds exactly like the analog stuff, but working on it has helped me understand how that works. I keep getting closer towards it, and every step forward gives me something new that I can use in my own building or kind of working on my own stuff. So that's where I start, I guess, with the analog modeling thing. So just block diagram, build a basic version, and then start to try and hunt down research or other stuff people have done. KVR forums is a really good one too. I think they talk a lot about stuff, so they're a good resource as well. Let me see what else. Let's see here. What are favorite user contributors to the Reactor user library? I like lots of stuff from the library. I would say the new blocks that have come out, all of that stuff is amazing. And I would definitely check out all of the block stuff. What else did I? Oh, you know, there's a drum machine that I thought was really exceptional. We can take a quick peek at that. And I think I liked it mainly because of how it was laid out and its sort of simplicity and how effective that was. So if I go to user library, I have this drum machine that I downloaded, and this is called Clone Tonic, and this is a fantastic ensemble. So basically it is 6 outs, and you can split these. So if you're using this in Ableton, you can send the outs to different output ports. And if we click inside, you can see, because each of them have their own output ports, these will show up as individual mono outs in Ableton or other digital audio workstations. And each of these are the same synthesis engine, but they're super flexible. So essentially what you have here is this section lets you pick your oscillator, everything from sine, triangle, this whole sawtooth, or partial, which means you could sort of draw in your own kind of harmonics here. So this is like an additive thing. Then we have modulators. So you can do pitch modulation using envelope, an LFO, some sample hold, or the envelope plus LFO. We have the amplitude envelope here. Then all of that is run through a saturator. Lots of different choices here. Then we have a noise component over here. So this is like filtered noise. You can do some repeats, and you have some EQ and then a limiter. And what's interesting is these are all of the basic pieces that you would find in something like the 909 for various parts, like the claps or the kicks or the snares. I don't think you could do, although you might even be able to do something like the rim shot, where it's like these kind of tuned oscillators using something like this partial oscillator up here. But it's amazing what you can get out of this. So as an example here, I'll just use, he's got these different ones here. Let's see if I can, right? So if I pop over here, we can do repeats. And again, just as kind of an aside, this is part of one of my favorite things about Reactor is right now, if I really like the sound, but I want to be able to modulate this knob here, you can always just control click on it, say show and structure, and it'll take you to the section where that exists and highlight it. So now if I wanted to add an LFO here, it would be as simple as saying something like, give me an LFO, and then I would need something like an add, like this. So I could add this, and now that I know where these two are, start with this one because it's closer. So we'll say add that to the frequency. And if you ever see this red wire, by the way, it just means that you need to make your object mono. All right, so now we have our mono object. Let's go find where this other wire is connected. And where did I just put the plus object? Yeah, here we are. So let's go find this other one is connected here, so we'll replace that as well. Okay, great. So now we've hooked up an LFO, and I'm just going to set a super low frequency, constant of something like 0.5, an amplitude of something like, I don't know, we'll just say, I'm just making up numbers right now. So now I'm just applying the signal to it, and if I press now, we should hopefully hear some modulation. And so this is, again, one of the things I love about Reactor is I really like this ensemble. I think it's very easy to make percussion sounds on it, very sort of like straight up synthesis drums. But then if I had an idea where I'm like, oh, I'd love to modulate that somehow, it's as simple as just jumping into the structure and modifying it yourself. So this is probably my favorite part about Reactor, to be able to do stuff like that, where I'm like, oh, it would be great if I could do this other thing. So I really like this one. Again, like I was saying, anything by Lazyfish, I find that's always really amazing. So if you go to something like Lazyfish, should have, let's see if I can find anything. I'm not sure if this install has this stuff. Oh, Native Instruments, let's see. Reactor, factory library. Let me see. Fast Effects, I think. Yeah. So Fast Effects is by Lazyfish, if I remember correctly. And if you jump inside here, this one is great. It leverages that things we were talking about earlier about the polyphony. Let's see if I can find. I'd have to jump in here to figure out where it was again. But yeah, this one is amazing. And effectively what this does is you'll have a bunch of different effects. So we have a freeze, splice manipulator, filter, all these kinds of things. And you can kind of reorder them on the fly and put your audio through it. But what's really cool is how he reconfigures the different effects processors on the fly and going in and checking out this mix section here, or rather, sorry, this effects bus here. This kind of crazy rat's nest of wires essentially lets him route stuff in and out of these different effects. So your signal comes in here and gets routed in and out of these things and then continues on its way. So this is a really cool and very well done ensemble. It's a great one if you're trying to learn how to do some sort of dynamic routing, effects processing stuff. So I'd really recommend this stuff. And the Lazyfish stuff in general is incredible. Another great one he's done that I really, really like is the sound generator here. Screewell is kind of like a very classic Reactor. So this one here uses some very interesting stuff. And here you can see it says it's the Lesage curves or display. So this is when you take audio in driving a cursor left and right, and then another signal driving it up and down. And you're going to get these amazing sort of signals. I'll turn the volume down here so you just kind of watch. But he's got all of this stuff here. And if you pick different versions, you get very different patterns. And we actually we can build a very simple version of this to help understand it. But again, this is the fun thing about Reactor, is also kind of combining visual and audio stuff. So, so maybe we'll build one of those here in a second. All right, let's take a look and see other questions before I just keep building things. Let's see. Yeah, I could just build, why don't we do that? We can build just this sort of curve generator, Lesage curve sound generator thing. It's very easy, very quick, and it looks pretty cool. It's a good starting point for much more complicated stuff. So I'll show you what we're about to build. So if I go to Files here, let's see. Right, so if I go here like this, so with this we can do right. So essentially there's lots of different visuals you can make, and if I increase the sample rate, the visuals change as well, which is really nice. So let's take a look at how this is done. It's actually very simple. So all this consists of is 2 sine waves, a delay, a scope, and some modulation. So we'll build something similar to this from scratch, see how much of it I can remember, and we'll see where we get to. So the first thing we're going to want is we need the scope, right? So the whole point of this is to have some sort of visualizer. So if you go in here, we can go into panel and pull up a scope object like this. But actually, now that I think about it, sorry, you're going to want this XY display like this. So this is the one we want here. The XY display is very useful. You can use it as an oscilloscope. You can use it to control stuff, to draw things. It has lots and lots of uses. In our case, what we want to do is send a signal into the X input and the Y input and have that drive where this cursor is. So to start, let's make it a little bigger down here. If I go to the view, I should be able to say something like 400 by 400 like this. I'll pull this up so we can see. And we don't need to see this cursor, so I can go up here and say cursor none on this object. And let me do this. And one thing you can do is see if this will allow me to make it always active like this. So now it's always awake, it's always looking. And yeah, let's see if we can get it to draw some stuff. So what we want to do is, we were using a sine wave before, so we're going to go to oscillator, just grab sine FM because we want to be able to modulate it. So we're going to say sine FM. And I'm going to put this in here like this. And let's just put a control for the pitch. I'm going to unlock it. Like so. And now we have a way to drive some pitch here like this. And let's make another control for the frequency. Like so. Oh, I'm sorry, not frequency. That's meant amplitude. So say control like this. So now we have the amplitude like so. And now if we go here, this should be outputting a signal, which is great. But we want to see something here. And I think in order to do that, I always have to remember how we do this. I think we want like a scope, if I remember correctly. And we need to add sort of like a fade time. And I might need to do, let me see if I remember how to do this correctly. I think I don't need this second one. I have to remember for a second how I do this. And our min and max, that's what I'm missing here. So X comes in right now, it's going positive and negative. So we want it to have a min of -1, like this. Perfect. And our default, set by 0, great. And I'm going to do the same thing for the Y. And we have a signal. Fantastic. Okay. So now, if I go back to view, I can probably make this fade a little bit, I think. Is that going to help? We will see. So far, he's not updating, but we will keep going and see what I'm missing. Perfect. Okay. So what I did was I just duplicated the pitch and the amplitude of the, I'm sorry, I just duplicated my oscillator, but it's using the same pitch and the same amplitude. And I plugged one into the X and one into the Y. And so what this is now doing is it's saying one of them is oscillating back and forth like this. And so we get to see a signal going back and forth from left to right. And there's a second one going up and down. And the circle you're seeing, or this kind of circular shape, is effectively where those 2 points are at any given point. Right? So it's kind of the left and the up and down working together. So you're sort of seeing the 2 oscillators working together. So if I were to unconnect this one, you'll see it just goes up and down like that. And I should be able to, which is what I was trying to do, is turn down the signal so we only see the thing move back and forth. There it goes. maybe if I just do cross, or maybe if I just do pixel. There we go. It's probably hard to see because of the, yeah, it's harder to see. But we have all these different options here for how this looks. But I find the scope to be the most useful. So this one is going up and down. This one is going left and right. Oops. Like this. And when you combine the two together, it's going to draw out a circle like this. So this is our first step. Now what would be nice is if I could add a single delay. So we're just going to say a delay like this. And we'll take the signal in. And now I want a value here. So I'm going to create another control. Again, just clicking on it, I can quickly make different controls. And by delaying this signal, I should be able to change the shape of the circle. And we can see that the range is too large right now. It goes kind of crazy. So what I'm going to do is go for a much smaller range, something like 10. And we're going to make the step size 0 so that it's continuous. And we'll see what happens now. So you can see now it's allowing me to change the shape. So now I want something slightly larger. So let's try like 50, let's try 100. Perfect. So now when I go like this, I have a way to sort of modulate the circle. So this is already cool. And if I were to put this to an LFO, you can see where you could begin to get this kind of thing going. So that's pretty interesting. So we'll set it to something closer to a circle like this. And then what I want to do is take out, well, you could have different pitches, different amplitudes. But before we do that, let's start modulating or FM modulating one of the inputs here. So I'm going to have a multiply with a knob. We'll call this knob FM. And we'll plug in the output of this signal. We'll put it here like this. And I'm just going to move the FM signal over. And let's make this, I don't know, something like 500. And we can already see that this begins to create something really interesting. Right? So we can do this kind of thing. And again, if we were to modulate the one above, it would start doing similar patterns, but in the other direction. And now the question becomes, what does this sound like? So again, I'll turn down the volume, but this is all being created by audio. So I should be able to take the output of, I'm just going to take the FM one, although we could add the two together if we wanted to hear what the two oscillators sound like together. So why don't we do that actually? So we'll add these together. So now we can hear the signal. Right? And that crackle actually, this is an important thing here. So this crackle, there's nothing wrong with Reactor. What it is this is an event-based input. And the event-based input essentially updates at a slower rate than the audio. So what we need to do is add what's known as a smoother. So we can basically take a event smoother, and this will should smooth our control signal. Make sure I'm not making that up. Right, so now we don't have those crackles anymore. And there's lots of other delays we can use to try and work on this. There's interpolated delays. They work better when we modulate them, all sorts of interesting things. But yeah, so this is the beginning of trying to create something interesting like what we saw in the other one. So if I open up our previous one we were looking at, we'll just do a quick walkthrough. We can see that with this one we have our scope. So this is just the X and the Y input. We have the single delay like we were using before. It looks like I'm adding some offset to the values here. And we just have our two sine oscillators. And we have a modulator here. So we're not even FMing these, it doesn't look like. But it does look like we are modulating the amplitude. So we're doing amplitude modulation here instead of frequency modulation. And when you add that all together, again, you're going to get this kind of right? And there's lots that you can do here. You can do all sorts of pitch modulation. You can do all sorts of FM modulation, amplitude modulation, ring modulation, anything you want. And by having these two different oscillators sort of modulating each other and driving this XY scope, you can create really interesting visuals that are very closely tied to the sound coming up. Let's see, what else? See if there's any other questions. Oh, what is your process for distilling generative patches into compositions? How about taking the set compositions back into a generative live state? So that's a great question. Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of go back and forth. Years ago, I was very into making the simplest version of whatever I was building, Reactor, Ableton, whatever it happened to be. You know, I would do these compositions, and then when you want to go perform them live or work with them, I find the problem with through composing work and then trying to perform it is that generally when you through compose, you do all of the best parts and they're done and they're fixed. And while that sounds amazing, it doesn't leave a whole lot to do when you're performing live. I was out seeing a show and I realized that they were using very, very simple loops and manipulating them and working with them, and that this allowed them a lot more freedom to create and work on the fly. It's also, you know, a little scarier because then all of these things that you hear in your mind's ear that you wanted to sort of through compose, you got to find a way to generate those. So yeah, I think it was basically realizing that smaller pieces of audio is the way to go. And so in thinking about how to convert a Reactor patch to fixed composition, I would say I print everything and then I go in and make all of the tweaks. So I perform it all live, try and generate material, and then I go in and find a fixed version of that that I really like. But then when you want to convert that material back into something that you perform live, I really think it's all about taking the simplest pieces, whether that's the Midi or some sort of audio that you're going to process later, but finding the most basic core of whatever it is that you're doing in your composition and giving yourself the space to try and perform it live on the fly and make the mistakes on the fly. And that's where it gets really interesting. So with that in mind, actually, just as maybe the last thing to look at Reactor, I think one of the most interesting things with these systems that goes beyond, you know, it's one thing to build your own synths, but the power of a tool like Reactor is to build your own sequencers in addition to the sound generators. And one of the most interesting things you can do, I feel, that is still very hard to purchase, is to come up with a generative system that works using probability or some kind of random or deterministic process that's very complex and you kind of have to react to, so that the machine takes on a life of its own as you're performing or working with it. So sort of as the last thing, I'll share this little piece here. So this is what's known as a Markov model. Let me open this up here. So if I go into my library here, I should be able to go down and look at, I think I have a Markov model that I built as a sequencer. And the way this works is that along each row here represents a step. So at the beginning, I will enter at one of these rows, and each column represents a note I could play. So think about this as your, you know, scale. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then your octave here, C. And the way it works is the filled in values here represent the probability. So there's 100% probability of playing a D, E, F, G, A. But when we get to this one, I could play a B, or I could play a C, or with a very low probability, I could play any of these three notes here. And what this does is it's not random, it's probabilistic, which means that by assigning a high weight to some of these notes, I can guarantee mostly the progression but not the entire progression. So it's a good example. I'll just play it really quick as we wrap up here. So this is just a sine oscillator. So I'll turn it down. So not very exciting in this particular case, but the idea is that it plays this part every time. But when it gets to these two, it does one of several choices, but the choices are determined by probability. And these kinds of systems can be cascaded into each other to create very controlled structures, right? So they're not completely random. It's not noise. Music that works this way, you know, if people are interested in this kind of stuff, I'd look at like Xenakis or Autechre and this kind of stuff. And it can be really, really incredible to work with, because then when you're playing with these systems, you're not fully in control. And this is probably my favorite part about computer music and things like Reactor is my guitar will always behave like my guitar. If I create a feedback system with my guitar, there's a moment to interact with something, but the system will always behave in an organic manner. But if I begin to work with a probabilistic system like this, and if I make it complex enough, it's going to kind of take on a life of its own and begin to push back. And that's really interesting, to have an instrument that behaves in unpredictable ways that have structure, almost a mind of its own, and that you build it so it's a reflection of your thought process and how you compose music. I find that some of the most interesting and powerful stuff when it comes to working with computer music and tools like Reactor. So I think that's it. Let me see here. I will stop screen sharing and say goodbye, I guess. So I hope everyone has enjoyed that. We looked at a few things. If you have any questions, I guess post them on the event page, or take the course and post them in the forum. I'm always watching the forum, so I'll answer anything anyone asks there. And email me, hit me up with questions. I'm always up for talking about Reactor and building things. So, all right, everyone, take care. Bye.